Welcome to Lesson 2, Module 3 within the Attack-Based SOC Assessments training course. In this lesson, we're going to discuss how you can use the attack framework to communicate results from an attack-based SOC assessment. This lesson fits into the compile results phase of our generic assessment methodology, and in particular, it is kind of a precursor for compiling results. Here, in order to actually come up with what the final heat map looks like, you need to choose a heat map that you're going to be presenting to the SOC at the end of the assessment. We have three primary learning objectives for this lesson. Number one, you should walk away understanding the types of heat maps that you can present. Number two, you should understand and know the trade-offs with the different heat map styles. And number three, you should ultimately be able to choose the right type and style heat map for a given context and assessment. So a heat map ultimately has three primary ingredients when you're coming up with how to construct a heat map to communicate your message. The first one is the scope, including the right tactics and displaying or hiding sub techniques. This is very important. You might have run through an assessment and done the assessment over all the tactics, every single sub technique, everything. But the final heat map that you present, maybe it doesn't need to show everything. Maybe it only shows a portion that you specifically want to highlight, or maybe it does show everything if you can get it all to convey in the right heat map. The second key thing is the measurement abstraction. This is mainly either categorical or quantitative. What are the buckets and what do scores measure? This is slightly different than scoping from in the prior module, in that, really you're choosing how you want to bucket things or how you want to present things at the abstract level. And then lastly, the color scheme. It's very important to choose the right colors to convey your message. And we'll give you a couple of examples of good color schemes as well as those that might not get the message across quite as easily. So here's an example heat map from that was inspired by some work we did, many years ago. This heat map is super useful to me, at least, because I can look at it and I can say, oh, no confidence, low confidence, some confidence, or high confidence of detection. Those are my red, orange, yellow, and green. And then in gray, I've got this other category of some static detection might be possible, or maybe I'm not looking at things behaviorally, but maybe I'm just my SOC is doing a great job of looking at things like from an IOC perspective. And this seems okay or even great at first glance, but the reality is it's really not that great of a heat map. It has too many categories that can really make it confusing for readers and for consumers of the heat map. It's really easy to get lost in the labels here. Remember, when you're going through an assessment, your task is to paint broad strokes, and your heat map should convey that ultimately. Instead, make sure to settle on something that conveys the right information at the right layer. I know it's smaller, but on the lower right-hand corner, this is the same heat map, but instead of using the low in orange and the red in no, we've replaced those with just a low confidence of detection in white. We've also changed the gray for static detection to this kind of like see-through yellow that shows it's just a little bit different than some confidence of detection. Just making these two changes totally changes the face of the heat map. A lot of the content is still there. There's less with regards to no and low, but most of the information is still being presented. Regardless of your use case for attack, it's always important, or regardless of the use case of the assessment, it's always important to have a good scoring scheme. Always define categories that are relevant to your domain, and when possible, avoid mixing category types. Confidence and likelihood, that's a good example of something that where you say, hey, I have confidence of detection and the likelihood of it being executed. It makes a lot of sense when you think about it, but in practice, it's hard to combine things when you're combining these kinds of categories. Always know your audience too. Leadership wants the big picture, whereas the SOC staff, they need to focus on details for actually implementing changes. Always choose good color schemes. We'll talk more about that later. Be they gradient, discrete, what colors you use, etc. And lastly, metrics can be great. If you're using metrics as part of your assessment or what you're delivering, but particularly with the final heat map you produce, it's imperative to always have a good justification for your numbers and your categories. It's really easy to get lost in the labels here. Remember, when you're going through an assessment, your task is to paint broad strokes, and your heat map should convey that ultimately. Instead, make sure to settle on something that conveys the right information at the right layer. I know it's smaller, but on the lower right hand corner, this is the same heat map, but instead of using the low in orange and the red in no, we've replaced those with just a low confidence of detection in white. We've also changed the gray for static detection to this kind of like see through yellow that shows it's just a little bit different than some confidence of detection. Just making these two changes totally changes the face of the heat map. A lot of the content is still there. There's less with regards to no and low, but most of the information is still being presented. Regardless of your use case for attack, it's always important, or regardless of the use case of the assessment, it's always important to have a good scoring scheme. Always define categories that are relevant to your domain, and when possible, avoid mixing category types. Confidence and likelihood, that's a good example of something that where you say, hey, I have confidence of detection and likelihood of it being executed. It makes a lot of sense when you think about it, but in practice, it's hard to combine things when you're combining these kinds of categories. Always know your audience too. Leadership wants the big picture, whereas the SOC staff, they need to focus on details for actually implementing changes. Always choose good color schemes. We'll talk more about that later. Be they gradient, discrete, what colors you use, etc. And lastly, metrics can be great if you're using metrics as part of your assessment or what you're delivering, but particularly with the final heat map you produce, it's imperative to always have a good justification for your numbers and your categories. Here's another example heat map. It's a little simpler. We've only got three categories: low, summer, high confidence of detection. This heat map looks functionally great, but in practice, it's really got a problem. When people look at this heat map, they see a lot of flashing lights. They see the color red, and that color red says, hey, this is a problem. Ultimately, red often communicates the wrong message. People see it they'll often assume it's saying like, hey, look here, this is a huge problem. You got to fix this right away. Glaring red error. You got to solve this. And really, you should use red sparingly. Use it only as needed to call attention to specific areas that need to be focused on. Only when something really is a glaring gap or a critical issue, that's when you use red. Whenever you're coming up with a heat map, try to settle on maybe a softer color palette. This heat map replaces red with white, and it conveys the exact same message, but for many, it's easier to digest because you're not coming in there and saying, hey, huge glaring problem. You're coming in there saying, hey, here's a heat map. This does a great job to position the results as less antagonistic. These are areas of improvement, not areas where you failed. Thinking more abstractly, even outside of assessments, always be cautious when using red on a heat map. I know it makes the most sense to say problem is red, but sometimes you can get into trouble using the wrong colors. And then being realistic, heat maps are not in and of themselves, well, strict. They're great. They're easy to understand. They're tangible and straightforward. They're useful to tons of people, but there are a couple of gotchas when you're working with them. Number one, coverage execution doesn't always align with attack execution in practice. Techniques and detection, or technique execution and the corresponding detection, those can vary. And there can be ambiguity between the two. And then per technique detection, that's not always the right level of abstraction. That's why we like to recommend that when you're coming up with an attack-based SOC assessment, don't just turn over a heat map, but always include a paragraph or two that describe the trends. Because when you just look at the technique level, you don't often get the right impression of coverage. Coverage is also not static. What's green or well covered today, that can easily change tomorrow. Attacker TTPs and the defender practices, those rotate. Attackers change their stuff all the time. And from a defensive perspective, what we did this month might be different next month. Ultimately, don't ignore what you covered today. Just because it's green now doesn't mean it'll be green in the future. Then lastly, always remember, attack heat maps are almost always approximate. If you're doing this as a third party, always make sure the SOC you're working with, make sure they understand and know this. If you're doing this in-house, make sure your colleagues understand as well. So we're now going to walk through a couple of example heat maps and just kind of throw out some commentary. Here, we've designed these as exercises. You pause the video. We'll go through each answer, but pause the video. And here, your task is to look at this heat map, come up with a couple of comments, maybe score it a little bit, and then try to figure out the right audience, be it a CISO, executive board, SOC leadership, or SOC engineers. Try to figure out who might be best to use this heat map. And in some cases, your answer might be nobody. So pause the video. We'll get back to it in just a second. Okay, let's now walk through what we think of this heat map and really using those three ingredients, those three things to look at for heat maps. There's a few things to see. Scoping wise, this is all tactics, there's no sub techniques. From a measurement abstraction perspective, we've got an interesting scheme being used. We have detection and mitigation where each are distinct. I have low detection and low mitigation, low detection and some mitigation, and so on and so forth. There are categories, but there are 9 of them, which is relatively on the higher side. And the color scheme is, I just use the phrase hodgepodge to describe it. It's almost random. It's just, there's no real rhyme or reason to what the colors mean. Ultimately, the conclusion is that this heat map is it's really hard to use and understand. If someone had to use it, there might be utility for SOC engineers, just because it does give you a good level of detail when you think about it from a theoretical perspective, but the way that detail is conveyed makes it hard to understand and hard to put into practice. Here's another heat map. Same exercise, try to choose an audience, pause the video, and then we'll walk through a solution. Okay, let's now kind of analyze this one a little bit in more detail. Here, we kind of use the three key ingredients. From a scoping perspective, we have all tactics, no sub techniques. Measurement abstraction, this has a small number of categories. Here we have unlikely to be detected or mitigated, some likelihood, and high likelihood. And then we've combined detection and mitigation, which has pros and cons to it. The color scheme is super simple. I know if you've been following along in the course, you've seen this is our favorite color scheme. So that's definitely a positive. Ultimately, the conclusion of that is that this is really useful at the abstract level. It's great for leadership, and maybe some engineers might benefit from it. Really, the reason there's that distinction between leadership and engineering here is that by combining detection and mitigation, we're really painting a very broad stroke. It's really a big picture of what things look like. And it might be harder for engineers who'd rather say, hey, is this detected or is it mitigated? And there's not much ambiguity or there's not much differentiation here. Here's the last one. It's kind of the same as before. Choose an audience and then we'll walk through it. Okay, so let's now walk through this one. Again, it's very similar as before. We're looking at detection and mitigation. Looking at the three areas we focus on, scoping is the same, all tactics, no sub techniques. Here, our abstraction is again combining detection and mitigation, but here we're now using some sort of quantitative scheme. We don't see the numbers here, but we know that they're underneath it. And then the color scheme is a relatively straightforward gradient. Green means a high ability to detect or mitigate, and white means no ability to detect or mitigate. Our conclusion is that this provides a reasonably good actionable level of detail. It's really useful across multiple layers. Leadership can understand big picture from it, but SOC personnel might benefit the most just because it gets into a little bit more detail than the previous example, which was just high or some. Now, because I'm using a gradient, I see a little bit more nuance in my coverage. We still have the downside of not having differentiation between detection and mitigation, but we think that that's kind of offset by that increased kind of differentiation between the techniques themselves. So ultimately, Just about most people could use this, and maybe SOC engineers have a little bit more advantage using this heat map. Of course, a lot of this is indeed up to interpretation. The ultimate point is to make sure that when you're crafting these, you think about the audience and how they're going to receive it. Some closing commentary. A lot of our examples just focus on primary techniques. Sub techniques are definitely things you can include, but if you look at this chart here, you can see that including all of them, well, from a communication perspective, it's really not great. Sub technique information is useful, but it can be harder to visualize. Some strategies you can employ for including sub techniques in your visualizations are one, visualizing a subset of sub techniques you've looked at, maybe only a small few that you think are most relevant, and then let the SOC know you've hit a few others. Also, know your audience. You know, looking at sub techniques is great, really for engineers and at the lower level. Including them for leadership, that might be a little bit harder. It might be too much detail. Of course, that depends on the SOC you're working with, but ultimately, as long as you know your audience, you'll get a better feel for how much detail and how many sub techniques you think are worth including. And then lastly, if you do end up throwing out visualization of some of the sub techniques, you've still done the analysis. So keep that sub technique information in an appendix or in another form. You can always consider turning over two heat maps, one big picture abstract one, and then one more detail that dives in more. So a few summary points and takeaways to close out this lesson. Number one, heat maps have three important facets: the scope, which is the parts of attack to include, the measurement abstraction, which is really what scores you present, and the color scheme, which dictates how your scoring is presented. Your heat map delivery strategy ultimately depends on your audience. In my experience, leadership tends to prefer the simpler, easier to digest charts, whereas technical staff can make more use of the details and nuance. Everybody still can use almost all heat maps, provided that they're conveyed in a way that's digestible, but there tends to be a little bit more bias between who you're talking to. Avoid red. This is a silly, simple recommendation, but it can go a long way towards really making it sure you can effectively communicate your message. And then lastly, you don't need to present everything. Include more detail in an appendix if you feel it's necessary.